Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tyger, Tyger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?
Hi, welcome to Litpoetry and an exploration of the poem The Tyger by William Blake. This poem will be very familiar to many with its quite memorable musicality. Oddly enough, the rhythm and metre of The Tyger makes it reminiscent in sound to a nursery rhyme, kind of like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but a nursery rhyme it is not. While it's very easy to memorise this poem, it is an incredibly complex and deep poem, far more layered and sophisticated than it may seem on first impressions. So let's go on that journey of discovery. To start with, we really need to think about and consider carefully the historical context in which William Blake was born and in which he wrote. William was born in 1757 and he died in 1827. And during the course of his life, he lived through the periods of both the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Now, this is a very interesting political milieu to be born into, and it certainly influenced Blake's life and his visions about the world. There were huge technological changes taking place throughout his lifetime, and in particular, England was rapidly undergoing a process of rapid industrialisation. Blake, living the bulk of his life in London, witnessed these changes unfolding in the community in which he lived, worked and breathed, and he was disturbed by what he saw. Throughout this period there was a huge influx of the population that was moving from the country to the city. And a lot of work was getting shifted into the terribly oppressive conditions found in the growing factories, where kids as young as 6 were sometimes working in weaving houses for as long as 19 hours a day. These were atrocious conditions. These realities affected Blake deeply, and Blake considered these conditions to be diabolical in nature. In fact, many of Blake's poems meditate on the fundamental shift taking place in the means of production of society, which was rapidly undergoing this process of industrialisation. In particular, Blake's poetry demonstrates a deep concern about modern working conditions and that they were, what these conditions were actually doing to the dignity of human beings who were forced into demeaning and repressive types of work in order to survive. So within these revolutionary times, it is not surprising that Blake was motivated to question the status quo and those in power, and to also give voice to people trying to survive on the margins of society. The poem The Tyger was published in 1794 in a volume of work called Songs of Experience. It also has a companion poem which was written 5 years earlier called The Lamb. And one of the things that Blake was really known for is for playing with binary opposites, dualities if you will, black and white extremes, the tiger and the lamb for instance. The poem The Lamb, which I encourage you to read from his volume of poems called Songs of Innocence, really looks at the purity, grace and innocence of a lamb, an animal made in Blake's imagination by God, a Christian God. When we get to the tiger, however, we get a much more ambivalent, dark and disturbing look at the question of what a tiger actually is, and how could Blake's loving Christian God then create such a thing? It's a huge question in his mind. Painter, printmaker, engraver, William Blake was a very versatile artist, but he wasn't well recognised throughout his life. Indeed, his work only shot to prominence in the years after his death. Blake was also a deeply religious man, raised in a nonconformist home, largely self-educated, a well-read autodidact. Blake was beset with visions and dreams, nightmares even, and these dreams informed and inspired his work. These religious experiences, when combined with the political ferment of the historical period, made his work rich and challenging. Blake's rebellious streak, of course, owed much to the American and French revolutions, which gave thinkers and artists of the time the opportunity to dream of better forms of society and to question the power structures that surrounded them. Blake's work also came out of the early Romantic tradition. And the early Romantic tradition has many interesting hallmarks. For instance, a dislike for urban life especially because, of the consequences and effect of industrialization, and a reverence for nature. The early Romantic period also celebrated the supernatural and the positive, effect or impact human emotions could have on life. This literary movement had a preference for the use of everyday language, especially in written communication. And you can see this clearly in the lines of poetry we find in the Tyger. And the final point of history to note is simply this, that William Blake actually got to see a tiger up close and personal. And he was one of the few people in London to be able to have access to that experience, especially early on in the piece. In the late 18th century, exotic animals were sent from far-flung places around the world to London as gifts from rulers, and they were collected together into a menagerie of exotic animals that existed in the centre of London. You can imagine this experience having a profound effect on William and opening his eyes to the astounding and awe-inspiring wonder of creation and the complexity and terror of some elements within it. Blake's visions and dreams were certainly a quintessential part of his artistic output, but they also had negative impacts on his reputation. He became much maligned, and many considered him a madman working on the periphery of society. At the age of 4, he had a vision of God putting his head up to the window. He also had a vision at night where he saw a tree full of angels. These are just some of the things that troubled his mind, and William Wordsworth, a very famous poet at the time, said, "There is no doubt that this poor man was mad, but there is something in the madness of this man that interests me more than the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott." It's a pretty fascinating quote. Now we come to one of the major themes in the Tyger, and this is essentially the problem of evil. Coming from a very Christian background and having a belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, the question for Blake was, of course, how could he reconcile his understanding of a loving Christian God with the problem of evil that he saw in the world? Blake looks at the tiger. He sees a ferocious creature with this immense capacity to inflict damage. How could a loving God actually create such a being? And that, of course, sows seeds of doubt and questions into the poet's mind, which you can't just ignore or push to the side, because that's part of the artistic endeavour, to embrace challenge. And it's also part of the human story to really look at these questions seriously. So he looks at the tiger. And we need to reconceptualise the tiger ourselves, don't we? Because when we think about a tiger, our knowledge is clouded and coloured and saturated by documentaries we have seen as we've been growing up. It's not very helpful in some ways, because our exposure desensitizes us to the immense power, ferocity, and perhaps awe and wonder that a tiger should inspire. We are kind of numb to the experience. Perhaps a useful thing here is that Blake uses a Y in the spelling of tiger. For us today, the Y has a strange making effect. Blake didn't intend this effect, of course, but nonetheless, the use of the Y encourages us to, in some ways, look again with fresh eyes, with our critical imaginations at this creature, in order to see it clearly in its terrifying beauty, in a new way. Anyway, so you've got this problem of evil, and how can a loving God allow the tiger to exist? And the poet wrestles with that. And like a good artist, Blake had the sense that life is not just about black and white categories. Rather, in wrestling with difficult questions and fighting it out, new understandings can emerge, new wisdom. Remember, Blake had a reputation for exploring dualities: light, dark, good, evil, love, hate, city, country, fear, courage. So he raises very interesting questions, and think about it. What is a tiger's purpose? To kill, to inflict pain, to survive. Its purpose is to destroy that which it preys upon in order to live. How does this reality then help Blake to reconcile the problem of evil? And what does it then suggest about the nature of God? Well, it raises some very interesting questions. So one of the things that Blake would have thought about and read into this situation was this huge new idea that God created the universe with a sense of symmetry. And in this symmetry, the tiger is burning bright. According to Blake, God orders the world, and you can see this type of ordering also taking place in Blake's poetry. You see this symmetry in the use of opposites mentioned earlier, and the question seems to be that, and the question rotates around the idea of whether this type of ordering is actually a necessary mechanism. In other words, does it actually give an explanation, for this problem of evil? Does it help us to understand the problem? As an artisan and engraver, Blake would have certainly appreciated this elegant symmetry in the world around him, this symmetry between the tiger's alternating stripes, between innocence and experience, as encapsulated in his two famous books of poetry, in the qualities of courage and fear, or in the idea he saw as inspired within Milton's Paradise Lost, the idea of the fall of heaven, which explained what was considered to be the human soul at the time as both light and dark. Pretty interesting. So the soul is light and dark in nature, and there is an inner wrestling that takes place between the divine and the fallen in human beings. In these different extremes, these dualities existing in life and the conflict they cause, Blake saw a powerful catalyst for growth and change. The conflict between opposites lies at the heart of reality for Blake, and according to this view, this conflict is a part of creative design. In wrestling between opposites, Blake saw that there was a burst of life and energy. He considered this phenomenon a necessary one because through it humans were able to develop virtues. I don't want to reduce evil to a simplistic formula in order to somehow solve the problem of evil and explain God. Whether you are an atheist, a theist, or an agnostic, quick, easy answers are inappropriate. And this is a question that has been bothering thinkers for 2,500 years. Nevertheless, the point, I think, is to find some wisdom in the idea of this process of wrestling. It is in the doubt and the tension and the conflict that understanding actually comes. For if we don't have evil, how can we learn how to practice good? If we don't experience fear, how can we learn to be courageous? I mean, it's a very simple mechanism, but it warrants our attention. The second theme I want to talk to you about is the idea of creativity in life. And in some ways, Blake's The Tyger is a celebration of creativity and what good creation is actually about. So as an artist, Blake understood this. He knew that the best art in some ways is an intense kind of experience, an intense pursuit that pushes the boundaries. The spirit of this type of creation, one could say, is expertly captured in the poem itself. The act of creation to William Blake involves four things: imagination, artistry, skill, and effort. And we see all these qualities in his poem about a tiger. Added to this is one more ingredient. For the cost of creating provocative art, there also needs to be a sense of courage. And this is why the poem focuses so heavily on the notion to dare. To dare to do these things, to dare to ask difficult questions. See, we live in a world where we like to put everything in its pigeonhole, to order our life in order to reduce our anxiety and fear. Yet this poem is an explosion that keeps us somewhere in the middle of the anxiety, grappling and struggling with a sense of death and terror, uncertainty and awe. And that's the profound thing about the poem. This tension actually creates a sense of life and wonder. In this way, Blake suggests perhaps that the act of creation itself won't be fully honest or authentic. It won't be fully realized without bravery and the ability to dare. And for this we need fear, we need evil. In other words, Blake argues we need the tension that the opposites in our lives create. It's a mechanism of our becoming fully human. In terms of creation, in the poem, Blake essentially makes God himself into an artist working in a cosmic workshop or forge, like a blacksmith hammering away at the raw stuff of creation. And to the poem, if you listen to it, is very much a celebration of creative risk-taking. In terms of risk, just think about the way Blake himself forges the tiger himself through hammering words and rhythms into the lines of the verse. The tiger stalks through the lines of the poem, ready to pounce on the unexpected reader. There is so much that is elusive and enigmatic about the tiger that he creates on the page. So many riddles he creates in the reader's mind, answers to questions that are so hard to solve or to find. For evidence of this esteeming of the process of creation, think about the words he uses, taken straight from the sort of engraver's workshop he was familiar with. The word frame and the idea of framing would have been commonplace to Blake the artisan, just as would be the words furnace, anvil, hammer, and chain. This is all language which characterises and affirms the process of creativity and the pressurised, hard-working conditions that invariably bring a new creation to life. Then in terms of creativity, really, if we go even deeper, we can start to unpack the divine associations that Blake has placed within the poem. Think about the regular rhyme scheme, the AA, BB, CC, DD scheme, which imposes this order and again reinforces the symmetry of the creation, reflecting Blake's belief in an all-powerful God with a definite plan for his creation. The idea of order from chaos. Think about the form and how the symmetry is also reflected in the similar opening and closing stanzas of the poem. Think about the link to the symmetry, for instance, in the tiger's stripes. and the alternating rhymes in the poem itself that echo that pattern. Think about the strong, regular and ordered rhythm in the poem. Much of the poem is actually written in trochaic, stressed, unstressed, lines. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. What the hammer, what the chain. This mimics the hustle and bustle of a workshop and the hard sound of a hammer beating down on metal. It's really in your face. It's alive with sound. Then occasionally there is an iambic line of unstressed stressed syllables in a line that mimics a heartbeat rhythm, such as in the line, "And when thy heart began to beat," perfectly matching the moment of apprehension that comes with the birth of new life, life born in a workshop. Combined, the rhythms give the poem an intoxicating complexity and sense of propulsion, moving it forward. Next, think about the mostly end-stop lines of punctuation. This punctuation reduces the flow of the poem at times and creates a stop-start pattern, and this creates this sense of intense pressure with little releases taking place here and there, like the firing pistons in an engine. Again, like a workshop running at full capacity, at full hum. Then also think about the symbol of fire itself and its links to the fires of one's imagination. The imagination itself portrayed as a kind of intense and miraculous fire from which things are created, if the creator is courageous enough to seize the fire. This mirrors Blake's life, perhaps, often seen, as I already mentioned, as a madman driven by visions and the fires of his imagination. His passion, for building a just world out of the terrible injustice he sees around him, experimenting, ridiculed, a risk taker, sharing in the creative nature of his beloved creator and being attracted to God for that particular reason. The final theme I want to talk about is the dangers of industrialisation, which really connects to the historical context and which would have been very important to Blake, and you can almost feel Blake's alarm about industrialisation metaphorically in his description of the tiger. Perhaps Blake is alluding to the Greek myth of Prometheus, who deceived the ancient gods, stealing fire from them and giving it to humanity, and in so doing creating disaster on the face of the earth. For this, Prometheus was condemned. In this, the fast industrialising 18th century could be seen as a type of fire of creation itself, where factories are making monsters, just like the tiger, ready to wreak havoc and pounce on the world around them, causing mayhem and suffering and poverty to the people who inhabit the earth. People then become, in some ways, cogs within a machine. In this way, the constant use of fire as a symbol throughout the poem could be seen to evoke the notions of the fiery depths of hell, which we know Blake was very interested in and that he witnessed around him in London as the Industrial Revolution took place and unfolded. And interestingly, we see that Blake actually illustrated some of the work of Milton in Paradise Lost, and that this reinforced his fascination with the idea of hell, which he saw in the industrialisation that was taking place in London. To finish, I want to leave you with a few points to bring our discussion to a close. Blake believed in a Christian God who created the world where a full range of possible experiences exist for his human creations, where good and evil, suffering and compassion, as well as other opposites, work on the human beings in our world to forge them into something new. Indeed, the poem suggests that the capacity today to dare, to have courage, is only possible in the presence of fear. Blake came to believe that a lot can be explained by what he saw as a necessary mechanism of binary opposites in life. For Blake, the poem also points to the limits of human understanding. For Blake, humans shouldn't just pretend to know everything about existence, but should dare to explore the world through their experiences, Of course, it can be sometimes scary to embrace this challenge, to see things like suffering as a hammer bending us and knocking us into instruments of love. However, in a time when science today often claims that everything can be known given enough time, it's kind of sobering and refreshing to hear the wisdom of Blake in these words of poetry echoing down the corridors of time, because he challenges us to at least attempt to retain and acknowledge that we live with limitations as human beings. We need to practice humility, to always leave room to be awed by the mysterious world around us. And added to this, he points to the dangers of a world of exploitative industry and the problems it brings. Thank you.